to the well where the water runs deep. Stay here with me. Stay here with me. Come to...
Welcome once again, dear friends, to the Creative Recovery Initiative, where we create some space to consider addiction and alcoholism and the places, both creative and transformative, through which we seek our recovery and healing. In the next few episodes of the Creative Recovery Initiative, I'd like to share my story, what we in AA like to call my experience, strength, and hope.
His was to be a long and heavy road, but roads that lead to healing necessarily pass through the fetid gardens of defeat before arriving at redemption's fresh air. His head pounded with that most precise of head pains, otherwise known as the hangover. His drinking had become so bad in recent months that such things were unheard of in his experience. Why hang over when one was already leaning over the edge of insanity? He met with Kent, Roger, and Reed for what seemed like hours. His stomach and his head reminded each other of their shared misdeeds. Soon a sense of clarity began to come. They would determine an appropriate date when he would tell his story to the church board. Later, with the board's direction, he would do so with the congregation. But in actual fact, the board decided to deal with it behind closed doors rather than alert the whole congregation to his woes and perhaps only deepen rather than lighten them. Just as well, since the very thought of pursuing such public exculpation was more than his fractured conscience could bear. There would be nothing delicate about any of this. There would be no opportunity either to adorn the sad truth or remove himself from its consequences. His mind reeled and boiled, drowning in a stew of his own making. And yet, weirdly, on some level, he secretly hoped for this. It meant freedom, and if he still remembered anything from Theology 101, it was that true freedom came through the willing submission of another. Since beginning his ministry at the church, slightly more than 2 years earlier, he had immersed himself in the work. Mostly, it helped remove him just a little from the overwhelming sense of exile and loneliness crowding his consciousness. This Apollo-sized burden of inner cataclysm had taken him quite by surprise. He was a Canadian boy through and through. He bled white and red, knew the ethos of the place by heart, understood all the bad inside jokes, the silly politics, the heady talk shows, social pariahs, and art house music scene inside and out. Often he had quipped, "You can take the boy out of Canada, but you can't take the Canada out of the boy." He knew her, and she knew him. So then, why had he thought it a good idea to pack up and leave for a ministry call in Oregon? Well, for years, his spiritual journey had been tottering on the brink of collapse, built on a thin, wispy, kitschy evangelicalism that no longer supported his increasingly probing questions. The shoes just didn't fit anymore. He needed to stretch his theological legs, lift his head up from the ripples in the wading pool and gaze out upon deeper water. But other voices had grown louder in him. Subtle, insistent voices calling him to dig deeper, places more suited to his shovel. His spiritual spade yearned to dig in a different part of the Christian garden. He had grown tired of snap peas and hungered for new manna. For as long as he could remember, he yearned for all things ancient, dark, and numinous, thoughtful and mystic, a poetic theology wed to older spiritual language better suited to who he was becoming, perhaps who he'd always been. That yearning drew him into the heady confines of Orthodox and Catholic spirituality, which offered him a context for a more sacramentally nourishing, liturgically demonstrative faith. It drew him to places where matters of social justice and peacemongering weren't just hip new phrases, but built upon irrevocable realities. It meant moving to live and work among a church community more comfortable in such matters. Intriguing and salty was the contemplative activism of this town center congregation, which included twice yearly worship services with the local Catholic Church, both Ash Wednesday and Pentecost. He was hooked. The diverse little community in this quaint Oregon college town, pastored by the man now sitting to his left, had been that place. The only place whose centripetal force had provided sufficient gravitas to pull him out of his home and native land. The journey, however, would prove much more perilous than either of them could have imagined. The stress of that journey, coupled with a DNA predisposed to narcissistic, alcoholic self-destruction, provided a primary reason for why he sat in this very room under such unenviable circumstances. A long, serpentine road lay ahead, the end of which only God knew. But now, in this room, today was enough.
Come to the water that never runs dry. Drink here while